Hello, welcome to this tutorial on approaches for modeling brain responses to natural language using NLP. My name is Leila Wehbe. I'm an assistant professor in the machine learning department at the Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. So let's dive right in because of the limited time frame. So I'm just going to show you right away how a naturalistic experiments look like. On the bottom here, you'll see what the subjects see. And at the top, we're actually going to look at data on the flattened brain so that we can see the whole brain at the same time. Just to orient you very quickly, here's the visual cortex, it's right frontal and temporal. And so you can see here what the subjects are seeing along with their recorded brain activity. And so this is complex data. We would like to answer a large variety of questions using this data. We would like to answer questions such as, how is the brain perceiving these individual words? How, for example, are semantics and syntax processed in the same regions? How are is the brain combining these different words, etc. And it's not clear immediately how to answer these questions. So what we have at the end of an experiment is a stream of words and a stream of recorded activity. And we'd like to build a function that goes from the words occurring at a specific time to the brain activity. You think of the brain activity across the brain as a row of voxels, where each voxel is one of those volume pixels that you're recording. And what we're going to do is we're going to abstract those words or represent those words in a specific space. This is a toy example. So this is a very simple syntactic space in which we are representing this particular point in time in the experiment. So there were two verbs, one pronoun, one article, etc. at that particular point in time. And then we're going to build a function that goes from what occurred at that time to the brain activity. Now, the trick or the problem here is that fMRI is actually quite slow. What we're measuring is a change in the blood oxygen level that happens or peaks 5 to 6 seconds after something happens in the brain. And so really, since when you're reading the story, words are coming as a stream, really what's going on is if, for example, you think of a specific feature, like a very simple feature here, like average word length at every point in time, at every TR, you can think of this feature kind of occurring at every point in time. And basically, you can think of the effect from this feature in a specific brain region that is sensitive to this particular feature as a superposition of the response from every appearance of this feature. And so we kind of have to kind of deconvolve these different appearances. And the way we do this is basically through an implicit deconvolution, which I'm going to guide you through it now. The first assumption we have to make here is that basically the signature response of a specific voxel to a specific feature is actually always the same. So here I'm just going to simplify this table that shows me the feature value across time. It's over here. And now I'm going to say that actually the canonical response of this voxel to a specific feature is going to look like this. This is kind of the shape of the hemodynamic response function. It's how we hope it would look like. But I'm learning this from like limited data. Also, just to say, if something occurs at a specific time point here, we're saying that the voxel activity is affected at the 4 following time points. And I'm saying 4 here because this TR that I'm using in the experiment here is 2 seconds. What TR you have in your experiment. And so it could be, for example, this feature actually depresses brain activity, or it can be that actually because you're learning from limited data, you actually learn noise. Like ideally, you don't want to learn noise. If a feature doesn't affect brain activity, you really want to learn just 0 weights. The other assumptions you remake is that the value of the feature here is going to multiply this hemodynamic, this signature response for this feature in that voxel. So if you have a small value of the feature, that will create a small response function. And then we're going to also assume that the activity that's generated at different time points is additive. So here at time t, you think of the value of the feature that occurred here at time t minus 4. And the value of that feature is going to basically be multiplied by the 4th weight here, and so on. So here, another contribution here to this to the activity here will be something that occurred at time t minus 3 multiplied by weight 3, etc. And so, in other words, we think of the activity in that voxel that's created by that one feature as basically a simple convolution of the value of the feature with the kind of the signature response for that feature. And we're also going to make an assumption that the responses from all the different features we have are going to be additive. So basically the entire activity is the sum over all the features of this convolution. How do we do this very easily with code? So think of this matrix, which I haven't still told you how to do, how to construct this. So the left matrix is a matrix of features in time. So at every TR, I'm actually building or constructing a representation for the content of the story at that particular point in time. So this still like every row here corresponds to time. Row T corresponds to time T. And here on the right, I have my entire matrix of brain data. So every column here is a different voxel, and every row is also a different time T. Now I want to express this as easily as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my original feature matrix and I'm going to delay it. So I first delay it by 1, by 2, by 3, by 4. And so now I'm going to build a linear model that expresses basically every voxel here at time t as the linear. So it's take maybe, sorry. Take every voxel here at time t. It's going to be the linear combination. Okay. So take a voxel here at time t. It's going to be basically the linear combination of this row over here, which is actually the value of that feature at the 4 previous TRs. So this is quite a simple way to just think about the entire problem by delaying the features and just using them as a big feature matrix. So we've gone, now that you know how to delay this information, these feature spaces, we can talk more globally about encoding models. So encoding models replace the stimulus with a feature space that's appropriately delayed according to the fMRI hemodynamic response. And then you learn this predictive model of this matrix W for a linear model to predict the brain activity in different regions. And then you have to actually test it. So you have to test it on held out data. And in order to do that, you take a portion of the experiments you've not trained on. So here, this is basically just a few words, but of course, the test data is much longer than that. You take the features for that particular portion of the experiment. You take your learned trained model, you predict the data, and then you contrast the predicted data with the real data. So in some voxels, there's not going to be a correspondence between the prediction and the real data because maybe these voxels don't care about the specific feature that you're modeling. But in others, you actually might get very good prediction. And so that you can compute, one of the simplest way you can compute how good this prediction is by computing for example, the Pearson correlation between the two time series. And then you do a specific, like the required statistical tests, which can, unfortunately, I don't have time to go into, but can be found in many of our papers. And you will find that, or the kind of conclusion you will make is that high prediction performance using a specific feature space suggests that actually this particular voxel is representing information related to this feature space. And I'm going to go more into that later. So encoding models in globally are actually quite a powerful tool to investigate brain representation. And in my lab, we've actually had multiple papers working on improvements for those models. And I encourage you to look into them if you're interested. Let me say a little bit more actually about the feature spaces that we use. So you can actually construct these feature spaces according to very specific hypotheses you want to make about language. So you actually can create interpretable feature spaces according to what you think is important. You can even use behavioral measures. For example, in this paper, we used self-pacing reading time and eye tracking measures as kind of a proxy for how difficult different parts of the text were to understand. And finally, the most exciting thing why we are here today is to use neural network features or language model features from NLP, which I think about as implicitly defined features, which are not interpretable, but we know are powerful representations for language. So how do we actually use these to create vectors for the meaning of words and sentences? So let's start with the simplest approach, which is a recurrent neural network. So this is how you represent kind of a recurrent neural network, but let's unroll it to understand it better. So basically what a recurrent neural network does is it kind of represents here in the blue vector a representation for the context of everything that's happened before. And then once it sees a word, each word will have kind of a fixed embedding. I think the magenta vector here is a fixed, like the definition of the word, the dictionary definition of that word. Of course, both of those, how to compute both of those is learned during training. So it's not something that comes from the dictionary. But anyway, and so once this word is seen, you can compute the context for the next word. And then I actually what is also outputted at every step from this context representation is the probability of the next word. So the word at this position. So different words have different probability of occurring according to the context. That's what the language model does. And then once you see the next word, you can combine it again, make another prediction, etc. And so the idea here, so back in 2014, we had the idea of actually using these different vectors and looking at MEG data of people reading to try to see where do these different vectors actually predict activity. And so we were able to trace the flow of information from the back of the brain to the front of the brain and in different areas using these networks. And actually, this has, after that, people also started using neural networks, for example, to study grammar, or even using neural networks to model fMRI data. And since then, there's actually been like really a great amount of papers. And this list is only until 2021. There's been so many more since then as well. So how do you use actually these models to construct an embedding? Now, again, think of this unrolled network here. You have a long sequence of words you can use to compute basically the context of this word, word I that appear at a specific position. And you always have a fixed representation for word I. Well, let's start with that fixed representation. So you can use this representation actually to represent single word meaning. So let's assume you for each word that occur in a specific time point, you can basically average or combine those kind of fixed vectors for those words in some way. And that will give you like just one vector for that particular point in time. And you can use that vector in your encoding model. Let me just give you basically like kind of an interesting result here that we have, in which we have used basically just a single word model, but actually different data. So here we started with people reading the stories from the paper by Huth et al. And we used basically these like an embedding, a word embedding model where the word representations are fixed, they're not contextualized. And we saw that basically when people read the story, actually most of the regions in temporal lobe and the frontal lobe are actually quite well predicted by the embedding of the words. And then we thought like, okay, how much of this is actually like caused by the narrative, by the fact that this is an engaging story where words make sense and they're part of an overarching narrative. And so we actually randomized the words of the story, and we just made people, the subjects, read them without any task. And we found that once we do that, actually, all the prediction performance disappears. So remember, this is exactly the same encoding model, exactly the same embedding, the same features. But now we're actually not letting people like read a complex and interesting story, but they're reading randomized words from the same, it's also the same words. And basically there's no signal in the brain. We thought maybe one of the reasons why narratives makes good signal is that you actually move through the semantic space slowly when you read a narrative. So for example, if you read about a scene in a restaurant, you like have so many things related to restaurants and eating in that particular place. So we actually clustered the words into semantic clusters, and then we showed them to the subject in clusters, which means that you're slowly moving from one semantic concept to the other. And when we do that, we do get an improvement, but really it's a very small improvement. And then we thought, okay, there's an additional thing we're not looking at here, which is that narrative, of course, has very rich linguistic structure. So we kept the linguistic structure, by just randomizing the sentences of the story. So you still have the sentence structure. And what we got was actually good performance, mostly in the language regions. So not so broadly as the narratives have, but actually more located in the original language regions. And actually this result might be why basically more traditional experiments really find more left lateralized and more specific regions that are actually activated by or predicted by language information. And once you make the narrative more complex, it actually recruits additional regions. And I also want to say here that this, again, repeat that the single word task here, the single word experiment did not have any task. So we think of the narrative here as the task that was being used and that actually created additional activity. But of course, in more traditional studies, when people show single words, they do have a semantic task, which enables the brain to create, to produce activity that is actually modelable. Okay, so going back to this is how you would actually use the single word embeddings. But what if you actually want to employ these language models for what they're good at, which is to construct embeddings for sequences? And so here, you can use, for example, in the simple RNN, the context vector to represent not only the meaning of this word, but the meaning of everything that occurred before it. Now here, now imagine like you do this for every word in your story. So for every word that's occurring, you use this recurrent network to compute the context of that word, given everything that went before. And now for every TR, you look at all the words that occurred in that TR and you combine their context representation together. So now you have a contextualized representation for that TR that includes information from words that already occurred. And now you can use that representation to model context. So when we look here at our vector, at any given point in time, it will have the context representation from the previous 4 TRs. But we're still kind of correctly modeling basically the information at different time points because we have done this in these multiple steps. And again, I showed you just a simple RNN, but you can use more complicated structures, such as, for example, ELMO here. It's a bidirectional LSTM, which means there's a forward component of the LSTM and a backward component of the LSTM. Now, of course, when people are sitting in the scanner and they're listening to a story or reading a story, they don't have information about the future. So you can, so you can actually isolate basically left context from right context and only use, for example, the left context in your modeling. You can use also the single word embedding. And also here, because ELMO has multiple layers, you can use for example, the left context from different layers and try to see like how it does its model brain activity. And you can do the same for more complicated transformers, which have, many layers. Originally, BERT, for example, had 12 layers. You can use the representation from the different layers for each word. So here, difference with the transformer is that it's not a recurrent structure. So for each word, the representation is computed based on basically the feature of that word at different levels. It's quite complicated to explain now. But you would see that actually, for example, in order to compute the representation of the word off here at higher layers, it actually uses future information, future words after the word off. And so in order to remedy this, one way you can do this is that, again, to just use the transformer by feeding it a sequence of words that end of the current word each time. So you're never including future word information in your representation. And again, you can take the representation from different layers. So now you can ask, okay, so like which layer should I take? So in this paper with Maria, we actually tested different models based on the ability to provide both word embedding and context embeddings. And we saw that basically, except for this particular model, which was not a great model for computing sequence embedding, sequence embeddings are actually quite powerful. So regions in red here are regions that are well predicted by sequence embeddings. Regions in blue are well predicted by word embeddings, and regions in white are well predicted by both. And you can see that mostly the brain is well predicted by context embeddings or by both both embeddings. And we also saw, we're also able to explore basically the effect of adding more words into, for these different models. So basically Elmo, which is an LSTM, and like basically which layer is better at prediction with how many words as input. And a general pattern we saw here, you don't have to look at all of the curves, is that basically the best models or the best layers in those types of models tend to be the middle layers. And so you can think of basically the beginning layers as input layers, the last layers as output layers, which are more basically related to individual words as input or output prediction. But the middle layers combine or like are more about the general meaning, and that seems to be very good for predicting fMRI activity. In this paper, we also were able to see, for example, how important attention, or we were interested in seeing how important transformer attention or self-attention was for a specific layer. And we saw that one thing we did is we tried to see which layers would suffer the most by removing the attention. And again, you don't have to see here all of the details, but what we found was that basically, like unsurprisingly, the more you add context length, the worse the layer become if it doesn't have good attention. So here we actually ablated the attention that's learned by the network. And we surprisingly saw that some layers actually improve in their ability to predict the brain, which is very surprising because we were actually breaking how these layers work. And so specifically layers 1 to 6. And then we made it here, like we made a bet that actually when you make networks more like the brain, that actually results in a network that better understands language. And so we tested this assumption by taking these networks that we had broken down by removing attention at different layers and using them in a set of some syntactic tasks. And indeed, we saw that compared to the base model, when you actually remove the layer from the first 6 layers, which have benefited from in their ability to predict the brain, you also have higher improvement in those syntactic tasks. 8 of those 13 tasks are actually significantly improved, and the rest are parity. But when you remove the attention from later layers that didn't improve in their ability to predict the brain, you don't get an improvement in doing those tasks. So in some sense, we were able to get some insight from the brain here to help or to create better language models. But again, this is just like a toy proof of concept. Okay, going back to our approach, as we saw that there's a lot of overlap between basically context embeddings and word embeddings here. And so we were actually interested in kind of thinking more about this question. And here we were interested to know, like, okay, is this because is like the high overlap because basically this context vector has a lot of information about the previous word that went into it. So there's a lot of overlap between the new meaning that you're building from combining words together and the meaning of the individual words. And so we asked more specifically, where's the supra-word meaning represented? So by that, we mean the new meaning that's resulting from combining words that's not there in the individual words. A great example for this is a sentence by Lina Pelkanen. The little boy finally finished his pasta. So when we read this sentence, we understand that the boy finished eating his pasta, even though the word eating was not there. And so this word eating is this super word meaning that's brought upon by kind of combining the words together. So how do we model this? So as I said, there's actually a lot of shared information between the context vector, the current word representation, and the previous word representation. And in order to kind of get at the supra-word meaning, we have to kind of control for the shared information. And to do that, we built a kind of something we call a computational control. So we learn a function, G, that predicts the context from the individual word embeddings that go into the context. And importantly, we learn this G model as a linear model, this G function as a linear model. And then we obtain the residuals of the original context vector and this function that predicts the context vector linearly from the individual words. And so those residuals are actually orthogonal to the individual word representations. And now we're going to use these residual vectors in order to model the brain. And the key idea here is that they contain basically this kind of orthogonal representation of context, which in other ways, it contains new information that's brought upon by combining words together that's not in the individual words. And then basically what we're doing here, we're doing a disentangling. So before disentangling, we had a lot of overlap between the context representation, the word representation, and after disentangling, we actually have much less overlap. And we see that many of the regions are actually well predicted by this new meaning, this supra-word meaning that's brought upon by combining words together. And we see this also, like one way to test for this is to look at the level of ROIs. And we see specifically that the anterior temporal lobe bilaterally and the posterior temporal lobes are well predicted by this supra-word meaning. And we also see this by kind of replicating the experiment in a data set from the Kurzweil Neuromod group. Which is a different paradigm. It's actually watching movies in the scanner, different subjects, a different scanner. And it's a movie, so it's not a reading experiment at all. And again, there we see, we replicate basically the fact that the supra-word meaning predicts the ATL and the PTL. Okay. Now to push more on this, so now we have basically what we did. We showed the stimulus to the subject, we recorded activity, we computed some features, and we found one way to think about what we did is we found the overlap between the variance in the stimulus features that we have and the variance in the brain zone. So we found regions that have this like significant overlap in the information between the brain activity and the stimulus features. Now, if you can look at this particular result here, you see that actually these regions that are well predicted are so large, and they're likely not all processing the stimulus in the same way. However, with an encoding model, this is really everything you can say. You can only say these regions are well predicted by the stimulus, but you can't tell if these regions are differently affected by the stimulus. And so in this work here, we built a framework in which the first step is basically to identify two regions shown here in these two gray circles here. And we find two regions that are actually overlap significantly with the same feature space, in other words, they're both well predicted by the feature space. But we still want to know, are they actually affected, or are they processing the stimulus or the feature space in the same way? So the second step of this, so here we can only kind of use this framework if both of these regions are well predicted by the stimulus or significantly predicted. So we cannot make inferences in these other conditions. And so if they are both significantly predicted by the stimulus, we want to test if they're predicted by the stimulus feature representation in the same way. And for that, we developed a method that's called zone generalization. I'll tell you in a minute what that computes. And so basically zone generalization, if it's large, it means that the stimulus properties that are captured by our stimulus features, when in this case, Elmo features, they actually affect this brain zone in these two regions in the same way. And if this, but however, remember that we're using Elmo in order to construct features for our stories. And so this might not be a complete story. So there might still be features that we're not accounting for that actually affect these brain regions differently. So it seems like the brain regions are responding the same, but actually it's just because we don't have all the features. And similarly, in the opposite direction, if we have small zone generalization between those two regions, we can conclude that at least some stimulus properties are affecting these brain regions differently, but we don't know whether there's other features that are not in our feature space that are affecting these regions in the same way. So I don't have time now to go into the more details about this framework, but the next step of the framework helps with the next question. It helps us realize whether if it seems like the brain zones are responding differently to the stimulus? Is it because we are missing features that are actually for which they respond similarly? And at the same time, if these regions appear like they respond similarly to the stimulus, are we missing features for which they react differently? So zone generalization is actually an easy measure to compute. Once you have a predictive model for one region, you use it to make prediction for the other regions. And so actually that just translates into correlating the predictions for region 1 with the predictions for region 2. And going back to our model, our results from this experiment here, we can look at Jones generalization between different voxels in the PTL of each subject, as well as between the PTL and the ATL. And we saw that we find actually 2 clusters in the PTL and that responds very similar to each other. So there's like 2 clusters of voxels that are similar to each other. And actually one of those clusters is also similar to a cluster in the ATL. And you can see this actually across subjects. And we can also plot these regions on the brains of each subject. They're kind of a little bit left lateralized. And these regions this particular cluster of voxels are actually processing similar information. Like they might be actually communicating with each other during language processing, most likely. I'm not going to talk about tone residuals for the interest of time, but you can learn more about it in the paper. And the kind of inferences that you can make in this paper are, for example, between those 2 regions here, which is in the kind of the middle temporal lobe and the angular gyrus. These 2 regions are mostly representing or reacting to different features of the stimulus, whereas, for instance, the anterior temporal lobe and the middle temporal lobe are basically responding similarly and differently to the stimulus, but ELMO, our feature representation we're using here, is missing the properties for which these 2 zones actually respond similarly, differently. Right. So this tutorial does not have an MEG component, but I want to talk very quickly about how you can apply the same methods to model MEG. And actually, if you do the supraWord modeling, you actually end up with very surprising results. So remember, with MEG, you're recording from each region with a high temporal resolution. So you actually can do something more interesting. So not just like model different brain regions, but also model them in time and maybe look at different time windows. So you do the analysis for different time windows in every region. And so you can look at also just the time component by collapsing over the entire brain if you'd like, or do both as space and time. And so here, when we do the previous, the previous control we were doing before, where we look at the original context and what time points it predicts when a word is being spoken, we see that when we actually control for other words, we are not able to predict at all from that using that context. So basically, the supraWord meaning is not useful at all for predicting MEG activity. However, when we look at, for example, the residuals of the word itself, so information that's unique to the current word, it's very predictive when the current word is on. And even information from the previous word is predictive of when the current word is on. But somehow this like supraWord meaning that's built over multiple words is not predictive of MEG activity. And this could be very, this is something definitely to investigate further and could be very useful for building brain-computer interfaces, because they would rely or they would need to use this kind of information. So I'm going to stop here, but please check out the hands-on portion of the tutorial to generate all the results that we saw here with fMRI. Also, if you're interested in other methods, you can check out this paper to see how to build, basically how to fine-tune a language model and change the weights it has with brain data. And you can also look at this paper, which is about representing syntactic structure in the brain, like studying the representation of syntactic structure in the brain. And more specifically here, we took basically parsed trees of different sentences, and we constructed graph embeddings for them. And we tried to see where is this information represented in the brain. And finally, you can check out my website for more information about all these works. Thank you very much.